Hello everyone, Toon World here. Hopefully you are all having a wonderful day whenever it is you're watching this video. Today I'm going to be showcasing to all of you my Bystial P.U.N.K deck profile for January 2023. Now, as you might have noticed, I have been on hiatus for about a month so far, and I admittedly haven't been playing as much as I had been prior to the start of this hiatus, so two disclaimers I want to note, and these are going to show up on the video so that it's easier for you to digest them. One, because I haven't been playing as much, this deck profile might not be as informed versus other deck profiles you might see for P.U.N.K out there on, say, YouTube, other forms of social media. So just keep that in mind, because I don't want you to think that this list is perfect all throughout. I do want to post this video now, and then let's say 2 weeks, 3 weeks from now, after I've had the chance to get back into the game, test a little bit more on, say, DB at my locals, I'll post an updated deck profile in the advent that any significant changes come forth that would affect or drastically affect the playstyle versus what you see today. The second disclaimer is, as I always say in my videos, I'm not the perfect player, and I just want you to keep that in mind so that even though I'd like to think some of my ideas are great, I don't want you to take them 100% as like the norm. Take everything I say with a grain of salt. This out of the way, today the video will be divided into the usual parts. We'll have our main deck monsters, our spells and traps, our extra deck monsters. There won't be a side deck portion because I'm just getting back into the format, even though the format hasn't changed too much. And so I don't want to throw out a side deck that might not be perfect for this format. Yeah, and mislead any of you into thinking that it is what might be better played at the moment. So all of this out of the way, thank you. Hopefully you're all going to enjoy this video. Remember to like and subscribe. I do appreciate it. That introduction out of the way, let's get on with the video. Okay, so for the main deck monsters, this is going to comprise the majority of this deck, very much like the last deck profile I had given to all of you about a month ago in, I think, November. Regardless, I'm going to showcase to you the P.U.N.K names first. I'm playing 2 copies of Shirakusai, 1 copy of Madam Spider, 1 copy of Wagon, 3 copies of Xiamin, 3 copies of Deer Note, 3 copies of Ogre Dance, 3 copies of Foxy Tune. So for the 3 Foxy Tune, 3 Xiamin, 3 Ogre Dance, previous videos I've gone into depth to explain why we play them. At this point, I feel like it is relatively self-explanatory since these 3 names are the core of your deck. So basically, play no less than 3, and I won't give any more details on those. I'm admittedly still on 3 Deer Note. I still like the concept that I've sort of pushed in the past, where sometimes you aren't able to summon the Deer Note via, let's say, Rising Carp or through Foxy Tune. And so being able to open a copy of Deer Note, in the case you need to summon it, say off of the field spell or its own effect, is a great way to play through certain interruptions. That's why I'm still playing 3. Worst case scenario, you can always use it as fodder for Shirakusai's fusions effect. Yeah, and great transition over to Shirakusai. So last video, or last deck profile, I was playing 3 copies to max out. My idea was that it provided consistency to get to the Carp Rising line, just in case for some reason you can't open enough names, which surprisingly can happen fairly often. However, with some thought behind it, I realized that honestly this deck is so consistent that usually those off chances where you don't open enough names don't really happen too often. So I could afford to cut down this card to 2 in order to compensate for more hand traps, more concessions, as you will see shortly. The 1 Madam Spider remains self-explanatory. You still need 1 copy to search your traps. Wouldn't play any more copies than 1. And finally, the Wagon. So I was playing, I believe, 2 or 3 in my last video. I realized that was very unnecessary because usually your combo lines were banking off of the Rising Carp combo. And so usually you didn't need to normal summon the Wagon as your first play. I know there was a line that I kept talking about where you would normal the Wagon and then link it off into Amirage, and then you could summon a name from hand using the field spell you search off the Wagon. However, as I had played last format and as I expect to play during this format, that didn't really come up at all. I think I did that like once against, let's say, like 10 different matches, so I don't think it's worth it at all. So I think 1 copy is great, and since I'm still on 3 field spell, which I'll get to later, I know a lot of people have cut down the field spell to 2 copies, I do believe you only need 1 copy of Wagon to do what you want to do with this deck, which again, in my eyes, is trying to draw as many cards as you can to not only keep your resources, but also draw into disruption that can stop your opponent. So speaking of that, we'll get on to the hand traps, which comprise most of the names you want to be drawing off of your field spell, not the punk names. I am now playing only 1 Serenir, 3 Druis Worm, 3 Magnamut. You're gonna see that I have 2 proxies for the Magnamut. This is actually because I sold 2 copies to my roommate, and he is not in the house at the moment for me to borrow them for my video, so we are using 2 proxies for that. But keep in mind that these are 3 Magnamut, 3 Crow, 1 Ghost Ogre, and 3 Ash Blossom. And let me put them down here so my OC doesn't kick into effect. So the Bystial names should still be relatively self-explanatory in this very tier-dominated format. Having plenty of crows, or I mean crow-like cards, is great to banish your tier names. Of course, it still has niche usage into some of the rogue matchups you'll find. So I'm still maximizing on Magnamut, which is of course the searcher for the rest of the Bystials. I'm maximizing on Druid's Worm because it's the next best Bystial name. And then Serenir I was playing 3 of in the past. However, I decided to cut down on it. 1, because it isn't that great of a Bystial name. And 2, I decided I wanted to make more space for some more not concessions in my case, but more consistency cards, as you will see in these spells and traps. The 3 Crow, 3 Ash, same logic as I had in my previous video. DD Crow is obviously the same thing, or same logic as Bystial names. It's still a nice way to get rid of your opponent's cards in the graveyard. Ash Blossom, I know it isn't that great still, but I like having it as a sort of blanket option for certain effects in the tier, sprite, flunder matchups, and then also being able to hit a lot of rogue decks that aren't necessarily expecting you to actually have Ash, since Ash has fallen out of favor. So it'll catch your opponents off guard basically in those matchups. The 1 Ghost Ogre here, I am now playing this card mainly to be searched off of Dragon Drive. What I noticed in the past, and so what I expect to notice in the future, is that with Dragon Drive, there are a lot of situations where you already have enough punk names in your hand, and so you don't really need to search out another punk name, which is all I could do in the past when I was only playing punk names as level 3 psychic targets. With Ghost Ogre in this list, I know Ghost Ogre isn't that great in the tier since you know all other stuff floats. Nonetheless, being able to guarantee a disruption that can be used in certain interactions with tier, and of course still hit a lot of the other decks in the format, rather than being forced to search another punk name which doesn't actually do anything in your hand whether you're going first or second, is a very nice option versus the former. So that is why we have this in here. This wraps up the hand traps and the main deck punk names. If you have any comments on these ratios, or if you think I should try something else, for example the Kashtira package, which admittedly I'm not playing mainly because of its price tag at the moment, but I will consider playing in the future, let me know in the comments below. I love to see how all of you are innovating the deck for better, so that we can make this deck as good as it can be. With that out of the way, let's get on with the spells and traps. So the spells and traps, the majority of these are going to be very, very self-explanatory, and then there's a play set of 1 card I am playing that might catch you surprised. So of course we got our 3 Itelli, we've got our 3 extreme session. Then we have a very neat choice in 3 small world. And finally, we have our 1 Nashiwari surprise. So the 3 emergency teleport, I'm not going to go into that. I think you know why this is played at 3 in this deck, and that's all. 3 extreme session, so I can understand some of the extent to why you play only 2. You know, you don't need to have as many copies, especially after you get 1 card on the field. It's also searchable off of the wagon already, and that's easily accessible through your combos usually. Nonetheless, as I've stated in the past, and as I will state again in this video, I do like the aspect of this deck being able to draw a ton of cards, and so being able to guarantee the field spell as often as possible is very nice. Otherwise, your deck does feel very underwhelming compared to a lot of other decks that exist not only in the meta sort of level, but also in rogue levels. And of course, this plays very well as an extender since the special summon effect is not power once per turn. Nashiwari surprise, this is still my choice of the Punk Trap card to play. I am considering playing Gabu mainly in the side deck, not only as a replacement for this card in those matchups where surprise isn't great, but also as a life point gain for time rolls. So that's just so that you know that I'm not neglecting Gabu, but just don't think it's that great at the moment. So the 3 small world is the part that I was emphasizing in the main deck monsters and that I will emphasize now as a sort of odd choice. There's one way you can look at this, and that is that these 3 cards can be a flex spot. For example, I was considering playing Tactics instead of Small World. However, I like some of the applicability that Small World had. Of course, if you don't want to consider these 3 cards a flex spot, the reason why I chose Small World over Tactics over any other sort of concession or similar card is because I figured that even though this deck, you know, is great at drawing cards, sometimes the cards you draw aren't the cards you need. And you might have noticed that playing through your games, sometimes you draw way too many Punk names, but none of your Bystials or hand traps. Then there are other games where you draw too many Bystials or hand traps and you don't draw any Punk names or follow-up. Small World aims to alleviate this problem where, of course, you can exchange either Punk name for a hand trap or a Bystial name, or you can exchange a hand trap or Bystial name for a Punk name. So I think that sort of duality, giving this deck the extra consistency to get to those disruptions that it so longingly wants to draw, is a reason why this is a neat deck in the current list. Of course, as I stated at the start of the video, I haven't had the chance to test with this deck too much, so this might be a misinformed choice. Nonetheless, I do think that this has some merit, and I do commend some of my peers for having suggested this to me, and I really like the theory. So that's it for the spells and traps. Remember again, as I stated in the main deck monsters portion, you can always leave comments below if you have any questions or suggestions. Otherwise, we will get to the extra deck. So the extra deck. There are some spots that can be interchanged, and you will see that the majority of this deck, this extra deck, is still the same as it was last time. However, I made some tweaks based on some trends I had seen towards my end of my testing before I went on my hiatus. Also, no, mainly just that, honestly. So we're playing 1 Rising Carp, 1 Dingrus, make sure I do this quickly, 1 Cross Sheet, 1 Asa, 1 Dark, 1 Unicorn, 1 Access Code, 1 Underworld Goddess, 2 Dragon Drive, 1 Draco Berserker, 1 Shen, 1 Psychic and Punisher, 2 Amazing Dragon. The 2 Dragon Drive, 2 Amazing Dragon, 1 Rising Carp should still be self-explanatory. This is your main combo piece. I do believe you need at least 2 copies, 1 for your going first combo, 1 for follow-up. And then Amazing Dragon, same concept where usually your end board is Shirakusai plus level 8 to quick synchro into this during your opponent's turn. So you need 1 copy for that reason, and then another copy as follow-up. Psychic and Punisher is still in here because, of course, it is your next best level 11 synchro monster for this deck, being able to be giant towers that sometimes tier and other decks can't out if they don't play Underworld Goddess or don't have a big enough monster to beat over it. Shen is in here. it is a target for when you have a level 3 tuner and one of your Bystial names on board. Haven't summoned it too much in the past, but I have heard that it is being used still in Punk, and so I've kept it in here as a sort of fallout of that. Draco Berserker. This is an alternative level 8 synchro that you can make in place of Dragon Drive. The banishing monsters effect that it has can become useful in certain situations where maybe you need to force or relocate like a tier name maybe to prevent it from being able to fusion summon with other stuff in your opponent's graveyard to make itself into a Kaleido or like a Rhino Heart, etc. So that's nice. For the Link monsters, Underworld Goddess is here to out towers. Access Code Talker Unicorn, self-explanatory in terms of Link climb. Dark and Asa. Dark's obviously the best charmer we have right now, tier names all being Dark. Asa's in here for the sake of the the Ishizu names, since you can make this a lot easier than Dark. With Dark you usually have to have a Bystial name or Ogre Dance on field, which is sometimes considerably harder than the former. Cross Sheep, this is replacing our copy of Amirage. Now that we're only playing one copy of Wagon, the Amirage doesn't really come up that often, and so it becomes sort of a very low impact extra deck slot if you kept it in. Cross Sheep was coined to me by some viewers, and I do like the concept where basically versus the Charmers, which rely on your opponent's graveyard to Link climb, Cross Sheep just relies on yourself. So as long as you can summon Rising Carp to one of its zones, you can trigger Cross Sheep's effect to summon another Punk name from graveyard to your field. You can then turn that into Unicorn and then Access Code, which is a lot easier than having Asa or Dark. Nonetheless, we're playing all three because each of them serves a different purpose in a different situation. Also, I believe that this deck does have the extra deck space to play all of these different techs, even though you could argue you could be playing, say, Baron if you're playing Gizmek, or Kashtira, or maybe you want to play a different Link monster like Phoenix. Whatever floats your boat, I do feel like we have the room regardless to do things like this. Finally, the one XYZ monster we have is Dingirsu. I just think it's a great card. The protection effect is great, the non-targeting send is great. I know it might not always be easy to make, or I feel like it's easy to make, right? You make Dragon Drive, the Deer Note can summon back a Foxy Tune or an Ogre Dance, you quickly overlay the two into Dingirsu, and I do believe that this Dingirsu can catch people off guard, which makes it a nice sort of, again, tech for lack of a better word, in this deck. So this is the extra deck, and we are now going to get off with the conclusions of the video. It is somewhat ironic I have a concluding remarks section in this video, since I haven't played this deck too much recently, and so I can't provide a really well-rounded comment on how I feel this deck performs in the current format. Even so, I just want to say that as of right now, I still believe that this deck does have potential that is sort of stemming from bias, since of course I love the deck, but really remember that this deck is a very consistent deck with a very neat stratagem through its 2 draws in the field spell. This allows it the opportunity to play a lot of different concessions, a lot of different hand traps that you can draw into. Also, the fact that everything is generic gives you the opportunity to stem this deck into other archetypes that can help synergize with this archetype and thus build a more cohesive strategy and or stronger strategy overall. So keep that in mind. The format hasn't changed too much since I last left it. You know, I guess you could say Sword Soul's popping up. Mikonko Libromancer might be a very cute deck to test around with going forward. Nonetheless, Tier's still at the top, and then you have Sprite, Flunder, so forth. So really, there's not too many changes to suggest that this deck would have dropped in relevance. If anything, it stayed at the same relevance point as my last video, and so that is why I'm still advocating for it as much as I am right now. That out of the way, I won't talk about side deck options. If you want to talk about them, I will talk with you in the comments below. Of course, if you have any suggestions and or comments outside of the side deck, maybe you have anything on the deck list I have shown here, please let me know below. I'd love to discuss with you any ideas you have. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching this video. I do appreciate it. Again, Love seeing this channel grow. And I do appreciate all of the support that all of you have given to me, even during those times where I'm sometimes out of the game and doing other stuff in my life. So remember to like and subscribe if you haven't. Check out some of my other videos if you feel so inclined. And I think for now, I will cue the outro.